Good evening. We are going to talk about pattern and texture today. Let's take a look at this first example right away. So, I am looking at this image and I am being taken back to the 90s. Yep, I recognize many of these artists and actresses on the wall here. And so what are we looking for, or what are we trying to define when we look at this photograph? We can say that there is a collection of images and that these images are creating a pattern. This work here, Adrienne Salinger, Fred H. photograph from teenagers in their bedrooms, 1995. And so, just out of curiosity, does your room look like that? Do you have your idols or your favorite boy bands on your wall or something similar? And so, when it comes to pattern, we are looking at a repetition of a design motif. Early humankind found patterns in seasonal change, like the lunar cycles. Patterns can be intricate or they can be simple. Humans have a desire to add visual interest to fill empty surfaces and spaces. That's a very interesting idea. When you have a wall, or a blank canvas, all you really want to do is add something to it to make it more interesting. And here is something that looks a bit familiar. We are looking at patterns. They usually begin with a unit or a shape that is repeated. Crystallographic is a type of all-over pattern. I'm guessing that a lot of you already know this based off of our last studio project. Most patterns are grid-based. Abstract floral motifs and geometrics are frequently used. Pattern subjects. Patterns are built on complex symmetries, repetitions, and rotations. And we are looking at work by M.C. Escher. Escher is known for creating artwork that play around with space. And so some really neat things happening with the repetition here. The intertwining of the positive and the negative space. A really interesting use of the color as well. They are really countering each other. Something about texture, it is there to arouse our sense of touch. Texture is more of an irregular repeat than a pattern. Texture makes the object feel like it has a surface quality. Texture is shown by areas of light and dark, shadow and glossiness. So what texture does when we look at texture from a two-dimensional work of art, it gives us the sensation that the tactile quality is going to change. Opposed to a flat object with no texture, it would feel very smooth and very plain. But when there are lines, when there are shapes, and that they are gathered together, it gives us a sensation that that surface feels different. And when it comes to texture, we're really thinking about the tactile quality of that surface. So when it comes to texture, we can create it in different ways. If you look at the example here, There's textures being created by the different repeated patterns with the different lines. There are lines within the lines. There is a type of texture being created by the varying changes in color. There's some texture changes where it is one flat color, then suddenly it shifts over to something a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more colors and lines to change up the overall composition. When it comes to texture, there are two categories. One is tactile. Tactile texture is something that can actually be felt. Another kind of texture is implied. It's something that can be observed and it is not touched. If you think about tactile texture, you could think of something like sculpture, where you are imagining touching the surface and feeling the grooves and the shapes on that particular area. When it is implied, it is almost as if we're just imagining that we are touching it. When it comes to more two-dimensional examples, you can see texture in a painting style called impasto. Impasto, creating a painting using thick pigment, which creates a rough 3D surface that has texture. So if you played around with paint, maybe with the earlier project, if you just paint on its own and you don't add water or you don't add any kind of vehicle, the paint can actually pile up pretty quickly if you if you paint on top of you paint lines on top of each other. When you are painting lines on top of each other and then you're changing the directions and you're really creating a different type of texture. So you'll see a lot of texture when you see paintings of this style, this impasto style. There are also relief paintings, and that these bring tactile textures to a painting. So we have leftover textures that are usually created by the brush. If you paint and you'll see the little textures created by the bristles on the brush, that's a type of relief texture. And let's look at this work here. Vincent van Gogh, Portrait of the Artist, 1889, oil on canvas. Right when we see this painting, we probably can recognize that it looks very similar to his most famous painting, The Starry Night. And what gives away that quality is basically the way he paints, the swirls, the thick applications of pigment, the gestural applications of color, and very vibrant color. If you look at the different highlights on the face, especially on the right side of his forehead and around his ear, some very strong lights and textures being created there. So what is interesting about Van Gogh was, he struggled as an artist throughout his life. He became famous posthumously. Really, he became famous when institutions wanted to establish art history. They would say, so where and when did this start to happen? Then they started to notice that Van Gogh is one of these early artists that applied this type of technique. And it was around that time that he actually became popular. So very interesting how things like that happen in the art world. And here is an example of a surface that gives the illusion that texture exists when reality when in reality, the surface is usually flat and smooth. So this work here by Roy Lichtenstein, Brushstrokes 1967. This is actually a color screen print. And if you look at the lines and how they appear very much like brush strokes, that they are lines that are created to look like the actual texture being created by an actual paintbrush. And beyond that, in the negative space, you see a collection of very tiny dots. And those dots also create a type of texture as well. Even though it is relatively flat because of the technique in which it was created, using color screen print, it is not painted on, yet it feels like the surface is creating its own texture. It feels like I can put my hand over that surface and feel all of these little bumps. There's also a type of tactile texture when we use a collage. Collage is a combination of materials. In this example, there's cloth, there's paper, there's newspaper, fabric. And so if you can imagine, we worked with mixed media in the past. Every time we switch from one material to another, we are adding to the overall surface quality. So it's not just one type of quality. And in this case, the artist actually added fabric. And I think I can remember students adding things like flowers or um, or plant leaves or butterfly leaves, in that those would actually change the overall texture of the piece. And so there's actual texture using found materials. In this work here, Anatsui, strips of Earth's skin. This is just a detail of it because it's actually very large. It's a whole room installation. This was made in 2008. And so what found objects are basically things that are lying around that weren't exactly created to make artwork with. So if you are at home or if you are out and about and you're finding these random materials and you're putting them together, that's what found materials works of arts are. And that's what the artist did here. And despite them being found materials, he's actually able to put together a really dense type of texture. And this is an example of folk art. Folk art often works with found materials. Folk art is usually something that is passed down from family members or ancestors. Here's an example of verisimilitude. It is a visual texture that is purely visual. It cannot be felt or touched. It is only suggested to our eyes. And what we are seeing is that it is giving off the quality that that surface has some interesting texture, when in reality the artist painted it so that it looks like it has a type of visual texture. So this word here, verisimilitude, is truly the same, quote unquote. Very large painting by John Moore, post 2011. It's not a photograph of these two windows right next to each other. It's actually a painting of two windows. There's a type of texture called a trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil in French means to fool the eye. It is also defined as a type of deceptive painting. And if you look at the example here, Jean-Marie Spannard Broadway Gateway mural, 1999 to 2000, Albany, New York. So imagine that we are under this bridge or under this garage space, and you see this wall. It looks like there is a wall and that there are these pillars holding up the roof, but also bricks in the negative space. When in reality, those aren't really in the negative space. Those are actually painted to look like they are far away. So that's what this trompe l'oeil term is all about. Basically, fooling the eye, making something that looks deceptively real. And so here's another example of a trompe l'oeil. Ed Rushka. Ed Rushka. Rancho 1968. And this is actually a oil on canvas painting, and it looks like it was created using water drops when in reality it was painted on. So that's what trompe l'oeil was all about. Basically, fooling the eye. It's an illusion. And that's pretty much it for this chapter. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Take care.